Well, today I'd like to take a look at the prophet Obadiah. Prophets are awesome in our Old Testament. They speak about the future, they speak about the present. They often share that God is working within us, around us, and always pointing to ways we can grow and we can learn. And so I'm going to have you watch this video on Obadiah, and then we'll talk about it for a few minutes. So enjoy.
The book of the prophet Obadiah. This is the shortest book in the whole Old Testament. It's a mere 21 verses. And at first glance, it does not look very promising. It's a series of divine judgment poems against the ancient people of Edom, which was a nation that neighbored Israel on the other side of the Dead Sea. However, there is way more going on here. So, first, here's the backstory. The people of Edom were unique because they had a shared ancestry with the Israelites. They both belonged to the family of Abraham, who, with Sarah, had their son Isaac, who, with his wife Rebekah, had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Now, the book of Genesis told us the story of these two brothers, and to say the very least, they had a tense relationship. They each later received the names Israel and Edom, which eventually became the name of the families that descended from them. And these families replayed the same difficult relationship of their ancestors. Israel and Edom had enormous tensions throughout the centuries, but they still shared that family bond. And it's that bond that was betrayed and shattered in the tragic events of Jerusalem's fall to Babylon. So when Israel was invaded and conquered by Babylon, the people of Edom took advantage by plundering other Israelite cities and then capturing and even killing Israelite refugees. Now, in other prophetic books, God held Israel's neighbors accountable for this kind of violence. And so here, Obadiah does the same for Edom. The short book has two halves. The first part is a series of accusations against the leaders of Edom, specifically for their pride and self-exaltation. Literally, as they lived up high in the desert rocks, but also metaphorically, they truly believed they were superior to the Israelites. And it's that pride that led the Edomites to not just stand idly by when Babylon came to destroy Jerusalem, but actually to participate in the destruction. And so God says through Obadiah that Edom will be brought down from their height and destroyed. As they have done to Israel, so it will be done to them. Now, right when you think you're going to hear more about how Edom will meet its doom, the topic suddenly shifts in verse 15. We hear this: "The day of the Lord is near against all nations." Now, why do we all of a sudden shift from Edom now to all nations? This verse is a hinge piece, and it links the first half of the book to the second half, where Obadiah announces the day of the Lord, but not only for Edom. He widens his focus to include all nations. And Obadiah says that all prideful nations that act like Edom will face God's justice in the same way. They'll fall from their prideful heights and come to ruin. Now, the combination of these two sections, one about Edom, the other about all nations, shows us why Obadiah was so interested in this tiny southern neighbor of Israel. Obadiah sees Edom's pride and fall as an example, an image of how God will one day confront the pride of all nations and bring about their fall too. It's hardly coincidental that in Hebrew, the word Edom, or Edom, is spelled with the exact same letters as the word humanity, or in Hebrew, Adam. In Obadiah, Edom's rise and fall is a parable of how God's justice will one day oppose pride and violence among all nations in the day of the Lord. But as in all the prophets, God's judgment is never his final word. Specifically, remember the conclusion of the two books that came right before Obadiah, Joel and Amos. Joel had painted a picture of what will happen after the day of the Lord against all nations. He said that God would perform a new act of salvation in Jerusalem, and that all who humbled themselves and called upon him would be delivered. And in the conclusion of Amos, he said that after the day of the Lord has judged Israel's evil, God would raise up the house of David and build a new kingdom for Israel that would include Edom and all the nations called by my name. And so the book of Obadiah has been placed right after Joel and then Amos to expand on these very promises about the hope of God's kingdom over all of the nations. And so the book concludes with a very hopeful future. God says he's going to restore his kingdom over the new Jerusalem, that he'll repopulate it with a faithful remnant. And then from there, God's kingdom will expand to include all the territory and nations around Israel. And so, this little book contributes to the larger portrait of God's justice and faithfulness that we're seeing in the prophets. The ancient pride and betrayal of the people of Edom becomes an example of the greater human condition, all of the ways that we betray and hurt each other in God's good world. But there's hope, Obadiah says. Edom's downfall points to the day when God will deal with evil in our world, but also bring his healing kingdom of peace over all the nations. And that's what the book of Obadiah is all about.
So what's going on in this book of Obadiah? Well, I've been trying to read scripture in light of the one who has been oppressed. I haven't really been oppressed in my life, and I'm wondering what scripture sounds like coming from one who is oppressed. In Obadiah, the Israelites have been oppressed over and over and over again. And their brothers and sisters from Edom, their own body, their own blood, they just watched the oppression. In fact, the Edomites acted superior, that they were better, that they were somehow had more power than anyone. And as Israel was continually being oppressed, the Edomites turned away. Didn't seem like they cared. And that's very difficult to live with. That's a hard way to live your life, knowing that someone's watching over you and not doing anything about watching you live deeper and deeper into oppression. And I kind of wonder now if that's what our Black and brown brothers and sisters have been living for hundreds of years in our country, how they've been oppressed and people haven't paid attention and they just thought things were going to be okay. Very, very difficult. And as we read these words in Obadiah, we learn that eventually it's not just the Edomites or those from Edom that are actually the oppressors, but it's all nations that become oppressors of others, and that all should take a look at who they are and what they're doing. How do we live a life worthy of the calling of God? How do we stand up for our oppressors? How do we, for those who are oppressing us, how do we stand up as we watch people struggle and have a hard time getting by? Do we ignore them? Do we walk away? I actually believe God has called us to stand up and to go and speak on behalf of those who are oppressed. And the interesting thing about this book of Obadiah, I think it's the last verse. The last verse goes into the fact that now all nations have come under God's judgment. God is all over everyone. The Israelites are back in power. And because they're back in power, because they have what they needed, how are they going to treat those who oppress them? How are they going to go after them? It says, and they will rule justly and fairly, a rule that honors God's kingdom. That's our calling right now. I believe it's our calling that we are called to rule justly and fairly and honor God's kingdom, because in God's kingdom, all are equal, all are loved, all are worthy. I hope this next week that we can look through and into some of our scriptures in ways that we never saw them before, how we can reach those who have been oppressed. Thanks be to God.